All right, hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On tonight's show, we have a very special guest. His name is Jim Ryan, and he is one of the founders and runs what's called the Freedom from Atheism Foundation, of the FFAF. It was founded in 2012, and it was founded in response to the perception of a rising intolerant atheism throughout the world. So he's going to talk about that. Their website is FFAF.Weebly, weebly.com, so you can check out some of their information, and I'll put it in the show notes as well. So Dr. Jim Ryan, are you there?
I'm here. Thank you for having me, William.
Awesome. Well, thank you for agreeing to the interview. For people who may not have heard your background or the FFAF, can you talk about your interest in this subject of kind of combating atheism and how you got into that?
Yeah, it's a great question. This is my background. I actually am a scientist, molecular biologist by training. So I used to be an atheist myself, believe it or not. I wouldn't say a very militant one, but I used to read a lot of the Richard Dawkins books and things like that when they first came out, or Selfish Gene, Extended Phenotype, and such like that. So Carl Sagan's work. So I was a fairly active atheist. During the course of my studies in science, the more I studied, I kind of came to the point where I started recognizing that, atheism didn't really make sense from a scientific worldview. I was actually quite disappointed with it. So I eventually came to reject atheism. And in that process, a lot of my friends, colleagues who were atheists, really had a very negative reaction to it. They thought I was, very, very harsh, surprisingly harsh. So I felt to myself, I said, I've kind of felt somewhat enlightened. Atheism doesn't really line up with science the way I thought. And I got really harshly attacked by a lot of people who I thought were good friends. A lot of people who were great colleagues. And so I had this, a very negative reaction of how I was treated by fellow atheists, simply for changing my view. And through the course of arguing with them over the years, I eventually, fell in with this group, the Freedom from Atheism Foundation. I've used a bunch of other guys who had similar experiences and came to, just wanted to, it really started as a sort of a way of sharing my experiences with other people, my experiences with atheism, why I left, explain it from a rational scientific point of view.
Right. And that's kind of, I would say, in the science field, it's much easier to be an atheist than a believer in a creator, correct? So I would assume that there's a lot of professional ramifications of taking that position.
Well, I actually wouldn't agree with that so much, believe it or not. There actually is my experience was actually there were more people, more scientists who actually were believers than there were atheists. I think what I've always seen, though, is that the scientists who are, say, theists, they would take a very humble approach and admit they didn't know things. They would, well, I'm not sure, but, I'll go along with this. Whereas, those who were atheists, although I'd say there were, somewhat fewer in number, were much more militant about their views. If you disagreed with them, they'd be very harsh, very much try to silence you. And I think in my case, it really was the fact that, I was sort of an atheist that kind of came to reject their worldview. And, as weird as it seems to be, they viewed me as some kind of a traitor. But I do know a lot of science. Like I would say, honestly, overall, I know more scientists who are believers than, scientists who are atheists. I would say there's a fair number of agnostics too, who just don't know, right?
Gotcha. Well, that's very interesting. And why do you think that this atheism is or takes on this intolerance or militantism?
Yeah, that is I guess the $1 million question I've often had is, well, why is it so important? I mean, for me, when I was an atheist, I looked at it more from a point of view as like, okay, well, atheism was a worldview that was aligned most with science. I think as I became more of a believer, I thought, well, let's just switch from one worldview to another. They're both compatible with science if you really look at it, at the high level. I think a lot of atheists really take. There's two reasons I think they do have this militant. One is, their identity is wrapped up on this atheist worldview, and there's no there's no real direct scientific support for it, or I guess seeing that there's no direct scientific support for it directly attacks their worldview. They claim they don't have a faith. They claim their beliefs are entirely science. So when you start tugging at this really attacks their worldview. And secondly, I don't think there's really no tenets to atheism. I mean, say you take something like Christianity or Buddhism or something like that, there really is this, this whole, I think, moral structure wrapped around it, that be kind to each other, forgive each other, these kind of concepts. And atheists don't really have that. So there's no reason for them to behave morally. For them, it's there's nothing wrong with attacking people. You know what I mean? So it's as far as I can tell. That's what I see.
It is interesting though. So they claim to themselves that they don't have a structure, but their view is to restrict other people's religious freedom. Would you agree with that?
I think that's a big part of it. I do think, atheists do have a worldview. They do have a faith, but they just don't want to admit it at many levels. At least my experience. And I'm not speaking for all atheists. I'm just taking the ones I knew. I'd say, atheists feel that, many ways that they're very enlightened. Oh, yeah, we can reject these ancient, medieval or, Bronze Age traditions. They really feel that they're enlightened, and then they want to to spread that view. In a way, it's kind of an arrogance as well. And they claim that they're beyond faith, and they're not. But if you really look at that, it is in human nature to have a faith. People by nature want to have faith. They want to believe in things. There's been a lot of work done on sort of the concept that people are hardwired for belief in religion, belief in God, and atheists claim they're above this, but once you really get atheist communities formed, they really do become very much dogmatic. Look at, say, communism, for example, Maoism, Juche in North Korea, Stalinism, Leninism, Marxism. These are, even new atheists, they really, really cling to this, you call it a faith, you call it a religious structure. They really do form this on their own, yet at the same time, they're claiming that they're beyond this. Which is it's very, very contradicting. Yeah.
And that is interesting, too, that you mentioned those communist groups, because atheism is a central component of that kind of communistic ideology, correct?
Yeah, I would say so. As myself, just to clarify, I actually consider myself a Marxist. When I was an atheist, I did follow the Marxist worldview, and that was the form of atheism I had. This was well before New Atheism and Richard Dawkins' God delusion. This was like back in the 90s. Probably early to mid 90s. So you take communism itself. I mean, it is an atheist philosophy. I mean, that's the course. It's a combination of socialism plus atheism. And, a lot of people think, well, atheism is just the belief of those God. No, there's various forms of atheism, just as there's various forms of theism. And people will say that, atheism is not a religion. And I would agree with that. Atheism is not a religion in the same way that theism is not a religion. But there are religious forms of theism, like Christianity, Islam, so on. And because of that, there are also religious forms of atheism. So, I hope that answers your question.
Right, no, it does. Well, when you say Richard Dawkins, I mean, kind of this predominant evolutionary biologist, when you say new atheism, what's the difference between atheism and new atheism? I don't understand that.
Yeah, there is. It's like saying, what's the difference between atheism and communism? New atheism is just is this title that they've come up with. What you would see is sort of in the atheism worldwide had its peak, probably I would say in the late 1970s. Probably the highest point, probably about 4 or 5% of the world's population was atheists, and most of that was due to communism. Communism being one form of atheism, but there's other forms out there. With the fall of communism and things like that, you started seeing this. We see a reduction in the amount of atheists around the world. It started declining at a global level, and I think atheists had this view. Well, atheism is going to spread. There's a sort of the religion is collapsing, and what you see since probably the 70s, especially once you get in the 90s after the fall of the Soviet Union, the collapse of communism around the world, there's fewer and fewer atheists. Meanwhile, atheists have this belief that they're spreading, religion is collapsing, and yet atheism was collapsing, going slower, and then you started seeing things like Islam surging really radically, evangelical Christianity surging really rapidly, Hinduism, surging, rapidly in India. You start seeing religions actually over the world growing greater than atheism was. You start seeing, and I think sort of when you see I think one of the triggers for new atheism was the 9/11, believe it or not. They were told, religion was dying. Here yet we see religion all over the world, expanding, and even things like militant atheism, or not militant atheism, militant Islam, really gaining ground. And I think this sort of a lot of these atheist writers, people like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, these guys kind of sort of like wanted to circle the wagons and sort of, build atheism back up. I think one of the also triggers was Anthony Flew, sort of the man who for 30 years was considered the leading voice among atheists, and he converted to become a general theist. I think. Yeah, all these things together, Richard Dawkins wanted to take over his mantle, take over. We saw the atheism in decline, and what happened from then is they wanted to circle the wagons, and it sort of coined the term. I don't know if it was them or just the media, but they coined their new militant form of atheism. They coined it a new atheism, but it's just one type of atheist stuff.
Just a repackaging atheism, and they're all kind of scientific. Evolutionary types, right? So they believe in evolution, and there's been recent kind of attacks upon evolution, which would kind of undermine the atheist worldview. Would you agree with that? Some of these newer studies where people are talking about intelligent design and talking about the complexity of the human body and stuff.
Yeah, well, and I'm going to be just to be clarified here. I myself actually, being a molecular biologist, who studied, evolution quite deeply. I mean, I actually see no conflict between evolution and a belief in a Christian or even a biblical worldview. I see no, and there's tons of books written on that if you want to get into that sometime. But I think the biggest threat to atheists is not that. Is actually the possibility that religion such as Christianity is compatible with evolution. That's actually probably a biggest threat to them, because their view is that, evolution is true. Look at all the science supporting it. Look at everything. And I would argue with them, evolution does make sense. I have no problem with that whatsoever. But I just don't see how it's in conflict with a biblical worldview. And I think that's something that really scares them the most. And, thinking back to my own personal conflicts with a lot of atheists, I think what really scared them was not so much that maybe I left atheism, but was the fact that saying, evolution makes sense according, it makes more sense in the light of a creator. I think that really is what scared a lot of people.
Interesting. So you think that evolution is not a threat to a theistic worldview, and then, but when you founded the Freedom from Atheism Foundation back in 2012, how did you contest against atheism, and what was your kind of approach, and what was the response of atheists?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, and when the Freedom from Atheism Foundation, it was really a web page, and there was a bunch of us on it, and there was a couple web pages that we kind of merged all together. It was actually the actual one that was called Freedom from Atheism Foundation. Believe it or not, it was actually found by a Muslim guy. There was another Christian group that was committed against atheism. There was another one that was sort of supporting the rights for crosses as monuments, for war monuments and things like that. And we took these 3 pages and we kind of why don't we just merge them all together and make one? And we like the name, the Freedom from Atheism Foundation. And that's how it kind of occurred. The earliest days, I thought it would be a lot of fun. I thought, a lot of people would, share their interests, share their stories. And that was my point. I just wanted to get on there and just share my experiences and why I felt that, science and say Christianity were not in conflict. And I thought people would be very interested. What we got is a lot of atheists come in there, very hostile, and they kind of almost took over the page. So I had to spend a lot of time banning people. I got into one early, I think it was one of my first discussions. I was explaining, I had this one guy, he was was explaining science, and he was arguing with me. He was an atheist. He, was arguing about evolution and things like that. And, I think he was a grad student. He started attacking my credentials. So I threw out here's a bunch of papers that I published. And he was all taken aback, and he started arguing about evolution. I said, well, look, I have no problem with evolution. In fact, I actually think, if it wasn't for evolution, I probably wouldn't actually, become a Christian. And I think that threw him for a real loop. And then they just start, when they do that, he just started resorting to just yell, swearing and, all kinds of, derogatory terms. So I eventually just had to ban them. But they do get a real hostility, when you start explaining these things to them. So that was my early experience with that. It was kind of a lot of fun. There was about 5 or 6 of us who started the page, and there we had believers from all different backgrounds. A couple of us were Christians. We had like the Muslim guy. There was a Hindu guy and a Buddhist. It was great.
Interesting. I mean, it says here you've had over 725,000 Facebook likes, so it's very active, definitely on Facebook. And how did it kind of develop? I mean, you've been doing it now for almost 10 years. And what are kind of the main takeaways that you have in this experience of starting this foundation?
Well, we started early. I mean, you got to keep in mind, this is I'm thinking 2011, 2012 when we started this. And Facebook was a very different place right back then. It was still, it wasn't brand new, but I think we were just starting getting groups out there. People, we were one of the early group. I think at one point we were, in the top 50 or 100, I don't know, of Facebook pages out there. I mean, it was a really fun early growth. And I think there's a whole bunch of us posting all the time. I think we did some paid advertising and things like that, just out of our own pocket, nothing serious. It's not a formal group. We're not like an official organization or anything. It's just think of a bunch of guys who just wanted to share their experiences as being former atheists. And we got some great discussions, a lot of, followers at the early days. Yeah, it was fun. And like I said, I would say a big part of the growth had to do with sort of a reaction against the new atheists, Richard Dawkins in particular, Sam Harris. These guys were pretty hostile towards anyone who didn't share their beliefs. And I think that was when we had a lot of growth. I'd say, this new atheist group movement, sort of no one really cares about Richard Dawkins anymore. Sam Harris has kind of gone off into sort of a new age spirituality kind of movement. No one knows who Daniel Dennett is. Christopher Hitchens dead. So it just kind of fizzled out. Nobody really cares about that anymore. So I'd say we still get a lot of interaction, but I think those early days when new atheism was really big was kind of our really exciting time.
Right. And so you see these kind of militants out there. What do you think that their ultimate goal would be if they could have more cultural or political power? Do you think that they would literally do something like what happened in the Soviet Union or China?
Well, I think so. I mean, atheism as a worldview. I mean, like I said, there's many different types of atheist worldviews, but none of them have really strong tenets. And those that do, they're really harsh. I mean, yeah, you just look at any atheist country or atheist government, or any time an atheist got into power, what happens? I mean, yeah, Stalin is a good example. Mao's a good example. Sure, you see what's happened in North Korea. But don't forget, there's also non-communist forms of atheism. I mean, take a look at Mussolini and Italian fascism. That was a form of atheism. You take a look at, People's Temple and what's a guy? Forgetting.
Right. People's Temple was Jim Jones.
Jim Jones. I don't know. He was an atheist. That was an atheist. That was an atheist religion. It was originally a Marxist base, but he himself was an atheist, and there was they used to mock the Bible and Christians. I mean, look at any time you see an atheist get into power, what is it like? What they want is more power, more self-indulgence. I would say, not maybe. Communism is an example of what would happen, but Mussolini is also an example. Jim Jones, I'd say another example. Look at the French Revolution. What happened with Robespierre and these were
Reign of Terror.
Reign of Terror. Anytime you see atheists get into power, they're usually, they consolidate more and more power, and then it becomes more aimed towards. And it's usually from an enlightened point of view. They think, well, they've got this enlightened view, and then when nobody listens to them, then it starts about stamping out anyone who disagrees with them. We can make the case that, certainly in the last 100 years, more people have been killed, by atheists trying to stamp out everyone else than have killed by all other religions put together, including Islam. So I think it's a very interesting way to look at it.
So with the Khmer Rouge, were they Marxist atheists as well?
Yeah, they were. In fact, Khmer Rouge, Shining Path is an example. You see, was it the group in Colombia? I'm thinking is it FARC? FARC. Yeah. These are all Marxist groups. Now, I don't know if they still are atheists, but yeah, certainly anytime you see like a Marxist organization, it's at its heart an atheist group. And, of course, since the fall of communism, I haven't followed every single group. So there might be some that don't care anymore. But yeah, generally as any type of Marxist group or fascist
So it would
group.
be even Antifa. So Antifa could be considered Marxist, atheist, militant atheism too. Then, correct?
Well, I don't know, but I mean, it might be. I don't think they really take a stand from. I mean, I'll be honest. I haven't studied them that much. Other than they're pretty. Yeah, but I would say it attracts a lot of atheists. I don't know if they've actually made a stand on we don't believe in God or anything like that. But so possibly.
So I mean, so you have. I think that the militant atheism and materialism go hand in hand. So, what is? I mean, are those counterpoints that people from the Freedom from Atheism Foundation make towards atheists? Do you find that they're? I mean, do you think that the atheists are trying to convert the theists, and the theists do they try to convert the atheists?
Well,
does that take place?
So on our page you're talking about, right? Yeah. So I like I said, one of the things I love to do on the Freedom from Atheism page is I look at it the point of view is I like to take a critical look at my former faith, and I do that by applying the same standards to atheism that atheists apply to other faiths. So and quite often I do that by taking a post that they've made about a theist, right, ever, and just twist it around and say the same thing about atheists. And usually you can do it. It's a very I say theism, atheism are both positions based on faith. It's just, atheism tries to call out everybody else. You apply it back to atheists, and I just like to see what happens, right? It's part of it's about me just exploring, taking a critical look at my former faith and just, having a look at it in context. So on the page, though, you get a lot of atheists who are very, how do you say it? Very, very, very upset when I do that. So I don't know if they're trying to convert anybody so much as just insult everybody and, try to seek validation, as it were.
Right.
I say the theists on there, a lot of them are on there just simply because they like to, it's nice to see somebody standing up for this kind of, standing up against atheism. So they like to chime in and say, oh, I'm so glad you're doing this, or, that's so true. And a lot of them are just, there to argue with atheists. And I don't know if anybody's trying to convert each other. I'm hoping for civil discussions, but, I think a lot of them just trying to point out each other's flaws, to be honest.
Why do you think that atheists believe that their view is pure science and not have any faith?
Well, that's a good question, and I think they don't have anything to fall upon. I mean, say take any religion. You could say Islam, say Christianity, for example. They have like thousands of years of history and these holy books and revelations and things like that. And they could that's a huge part of their worldview is based on having faith, right? Now, an atheist, basically says, well, we're against faith, so therefore we must have our belief must be based on reason and logic, and the ultimate in reason and logic is science. So what do they got to really hang their hat on? They don't have traditions of holy books. Their philosophies are very weak at best. So what do they have to hang their hat on? You have someone like Dawkins or Carl Sagan or somebody like this will say, actually, science, our beliefs are grounded in science. They say, yes, my beliefs are grounded in science too. I'll only believe what science says. But they never really take that to the next level. They never really challenge themselves and say, how is my belief grounded in science? I mean, one of the things that, helped me reject atheism, this was back when I was a grad student, and I had a professor challenged me one time, and it was more around the fact that because I watched a lot of movies and and science fiction movies and things like that, and she said, well, sometimes you kind of let your science fiction cross over into your science, so you have to really test everything you believe according to science and make sure it holds up. And I said, no, that's a good idea. So I took it literally, and I said, well, I wonder if my atheist beliefs holds up according to science. And I tested it. I found there's actually nothing in science that really supports atheism. It's a faith like any other. But I think a lot of atheists, they want to believe that it is supported by something. How do they claim they're right? They're arrogant. They feel they're enlightened. But how do they know they're right? Well, it must be supported by science. That's the only thing they can hold on to.
Right.
And I think that's what it is. It's almost that need. It's like they have to have it. If you take that away from them, then everything falls apart. And I said, that's the big thing for me. I think it was the hostility when they said, look, evolution, we know is true.
Right.
Creationism, according to science, is false. Okay, great. What if I said evolution, was compatible with creation? Well, that takes away their club. That takes away their weapon. That takes away the very, we say the cornerstone of their entire belief, and everything will crumble down on it after that.
Interesting. And one of the interesting things that I've learned about these really supposed hard science people like Richard Dawkins or Stephen Jay Gould is that they're culturally very receptive or empathetic to Christianity. Have you ever, do you have any comments or ideas about why that is?
Well, that is a good question. I think what we see now, first of all, I would say hardcore science. I would say I wouldn't call them hardcore science people. I know Richard Dawkins got a start as a scientist. I know Stephen Jay Gould was more of a science, was an ethicist or whatever. I would say they're more pop science people. People like, you see people like, Neil deGrasse Tyson, you see Richard Dawkins, you see Carl Sagan. These are not hardcore. I mean, they're not practicing
like
science,
right? Kind of almost info science or inter science type.
Yeah, they're pop science. They cross from the realm of they have a good strong science background, and yet they're not actually practicing science. When was the last time Richard Dawkins actually did a scientific experiment? What, probably 1970s? Right. So I mean, he makes more money off his philosophical views than he does off science. He just has science credentials. I mean, and I'm not saying he knows nothing of science. He does, but like I said, think of him as a pop scientist. So now to answer your other question, so why do they have this background in science, or why do they have this cultural Christian worldview? And I think a lot of them, when they take a look at it, well, what would a scientific or what would a scientific a world run by science, world run by atheism actually look like? What examples do you have? You can look at like scientific worldviews like the Nazis. You can look at scientific worldviews like the communists.
Communists, right? Wasn't his thing scientific materialism? Like it was science. You had this presumption of science.
Yeah, you have this presumption.
The certainty of science, actually.
Yeah, and I think a lot of these guys, like Dawkins, what I see for him a lot of times is he's lately, when he first, I'd say go back to 2001 or 2006 when he wrote his books, he had this, everything about religion is poison, everything is bad. Or I think a lot was Sam Harris who said, or maybe Christopher Hitchens, but they had this view that everything about religion is wrong. And then I think what he started doing is extrapolate. Okay, what if we took out Christianity? What would the world be like? And he could say, and I think they had a roundtable discussion. And it's really fun. I don't even remember when it was. I remember watching it. They're having this discussion and say, well, what would, if we got rid of Christianity, if we exceed our goal and get rid of Christianity, what would happen? I think somebody said, well, wouldn't Islam move in? And then he started thinking, would an Islamic world be a better place? And they started really thinking about that. And I think that's concerned them. What happened if you took away Christianity? What if we had a world like the Soviet Union that was very, very scientifically focused? What would that be like? I think a very atheist point of view. And I think they realize that, it's not entirely bad. Maybe they don't agree with the faith. Maybe they don't actually believe in Jesus or, there's a God, but maybe they realize that, if you take that away from the world would be a much harsher place. And
right. I mean, you can see that. Look at the Nazis. They had the scientific presumption too, evolutionary science, and they were the top. And then it's okay to exterminate these other races, right?
Yeah, there's such thing as, evolutionary theory, how evolution works in nature, and that's interesting to study. But when you start taking something like that and applying it to society, or, they had their very basic view. Well, it wasn't just the Nazis. It actually started with that, the German empire prior to that, having this view that, the little big empires, the strong empires should crush the weak empires. Nazis took a step forward, and the strong races should destroy the weaker races. Every aspect. Once you start applying, some scientific, theories to society, it doesn't always work. In fact, it can go very, very horribly wrong, as we've seen in the case of the Nazis.
Right. And why do you think that these guys, like the new atheists, they have a kind of priestcraft certainty? Like they're so certain that they've had science when science itself, or the understanding of science, has changed. Why do you think they're so certain is one question. The other is, what happened in recent times to split science and religion? Because back in the 15th, 16th century, all those guys, Galileo and Linnaeus, they all saw themselves very Christian and very godly. And something has happened where those two, in a very general sense, religion and science are now separated.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really good question. So I think we study the early history, scientific method, and all that. That was developed. Every early field of modern science was founded by Christians, believe it or not, and some by Muslim scholars as well. Because they had this view that, prior to that, the universe was considered a very mysterious thing. It was only, we could never understand it. It's only, could only be understood by contemplation or whatever. And, Christians came in that had this view that, look, we have a God who gives us laws. If we, therefore we should have laws in nature, right? Everything should be ordered. And so they went out to seek out laws in nature, and yes, they found them. And I think a lot of the early Christians, or not early Christians, early scientists who were Christians, actually went to study sort of this natural theology, looking for laws in nature to help them, bring them closer to God. They consider actually doing science a form of worship. People like Isaac Newton, for example, wrote several books on this. But I think what had happened is I think there were a lot of atheists. They said, well, we want you to be part of science too. Science is a good thing. We could use it to explain the universe. But the trouble is there's so many, all the powerful, all the real scientists are Christians. So they really wanted, and, science was considered more of an amateuristic kind of thing. There wasn't the scientific industries as we see them today. So they wanted to create a sort of a professional science. And one of the first things they did was try to separate it from religion. So there was this push. You see, like the National Academy of Sciences, for example. This was, really set up as almost an atheistic kind of organization, just for scientists who didn't believe in God or superstitions. When in their early days, they didn't want to invite any Christians into it unless they had no choice. But I think there was this push to kind of this professionalization of science and how they wanted to be part of atheism to be more of a scientific worldview. At the same time, there's several books being written to kind of put this, separate science and faith. I'm just trying to think some of these. There was some books about the conflict between science and faith, and where they portray things like, Galileo affair as kind of a religious versus science thing, or, Christopher Columbus and showing how the church believed the world was flat, which absolutely was not true at all. And so they really kind of sort of promoting this, this conflict between science and faith as a way to kind of promote, atheists in science, I think in the early stage, late 1800s.
Right. And do you think that some of the scientific views, that they're deliberately holding onto these views to bolster their atheistic worldview instead of the other way around? Whereas what my point is like they're taking pieces of what they see as science to bolster their atheistic worldview instead of objectively looking at scientific history. Does that make sense?
Oh, there's no question that they do that. I run into atheists all the time who are spouting part understanding of how science works. The worst thing I come across is these atheists who read some sort of like Richard Dawkins page or something, which is very skewed, very twisted form of science. And then presenting it as this is how science is. I'm like, oh, that's not even remotely what science is. Very, very, I'd say, agnostic or neutral towards concept, metaphysical concepts like atheism and theism. These are really beyond the realm of science to talk about. Yet, people like Dawkins or Sam Harris kind of, twist it a little bit, and then people just take it and run with it and pass off atheist philosophy as though it were science. It's kind of really weird.
Right. I think it's interesting when you really study these guys. They definitely cherry pick, and they're very certain, and there's not maybe that kind of objective, detached view on things. Like they're almost like the certainty of a priest in some ways to me. But yeah, please.
I was going to say, yeah, indeed. They have this absolute guarantee. I often see atheists talk about, Christians or whatever, blindly following their faith. And I think that an argument can be very strongly made that atheists, blindly, cling to atheism without any evidence whatsoever. I've often asked them, and this is really funny because, I'll routinely post a question saying, why is it that, atheists, accuse, theists of accepting theism, without any evidence, yet blindly cling to atheism despite the lack of evidence, So
Right.
And they all, usually when you ask a question like that, it's like, well, we don't have to provide evidence. I'm like, okay, so we're saying everybody but yourself needs to provide evidence. Your worldview is the one that doesn't require evidence. And, they'll twist it somehow and say, well, you guys are making the positive claim. I say, no, we make no claim at all. I'm simply accepting the possibility that there's a God exists. I admit my views are based on faith. If I have evidence, I'll change them. Do you have evidence to support atheism? You ask them that a few times and they get angry. They start swearing at you, and then you just block them.
Well, this has been a superb conversation. Really delighted that you took time to talk about your foundation and your views. For people who are listening, what's the best way to see the website and get information or kind of catch up? Do you have any other?
Well, I say like I said, we have a website. We don't really do much with it. It's there. We update it every now and then. I'd say just go onto the Facebook page or Facebook, Freedom from Atheism on Facebook. Just have a conversation. Go on one of the post something, ask some questions. I would say, just engage. Just if you're unsure about what you believe, ask around, and, go on our page and ask, and somebody, there's a lot of nice people there. They'll answer your questions.
Great. And so that's the Freedom from Atheism Foundation, the FFAF, and their website again is ffaf.weebly.com. And you can go to their Facebook page, which has an immense amount of 725,000. So it's got to be pretty active. I haven't seen it, but again, it's Dr. Jim Ryan of the FFAF. Thank you so much, Jim.
Thank you, William. It's a pleasure.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.